All right, let's do a quick recap. Last time we left off, Thrasymachus was giving his argument for why justice is just doing what is in the interest of the stronger. He said that the powerful get to make all the laws, and they only make laws that benefit themselves. Justice is following the laws, therefore justice is just doing what is in the interest of the powerful. Now, Socrates agreed with him that justice is following the laws. However, he disagreed that it was doing what's in the interest of the powerful. And he said the powerful can be mistaken about what is in their best interest. So if justice is following the laws, then it would be the case that justice is also doing what is not in their interest when they command you to. Thrasymachus said, well, if they are mistaken about what is most beneficial to them, that they are not the stronger at that point. They're not practicing rulership correctly, so they're not really rulers at that point. Ruling, he said, was a techne, a craft or an art, something like that, that's practiced through know-how. And if you make a mistake, it's not through your know-how. So at that point, you aren't practicing your craft. Now, Socrates agrees that ruling is a techne, it is a craft. But crafts aim to perfect their main interest, to complete their main interest. They don't aim to benefit themselves. So for example, medicine aims to benefit the health of the body. It doesn't aim to benefit medicine. So ruling is aimed at perfecting the people that are being led and not at benefiting the rulers. We'll pick it up from there at 343a1. When we got to this point in the argument and everyone saw that the definition of justice had been completely upset, Thrasymachus, instead of replying to me, said, "Tell me, Socrates, have you got a nurse? Why do you ask such a question," I said, "when you ought rather to be answering?" "Because she leaves you to snivel and never wipes your nose. She's not even taught you to know the shepherd from the sheep." "What make you say that?" I replied. "Because you fancy that the shepherd or the neatherd? I don't know how you say that. Fattens or tends the sheep or oxen." I guess oxen must be like, the shepherd tends the sheep. The neatherd tends the oxen? I don't know. "With a view to their own good and not to the good of himself or his master." And you further imagine that the rulers of states, if they are true rulers, never think of their subjects as sheep, and that they are not studying their own advantage day and night. So one of the premises that Socrates used in the last video that we saw was 15. The aim of a techne is to perfect its primary interest. Here, Thrasymachus presents an objection to that proposition. He says, but wait a second, a techne is practiced by someone, and that someone does so because she is choosing to benefit herself. Oh no. And so entirely astray are you in your ideas about the just and unjust as not even to know that justice and the just are in reality another's good. That is to say, the interest of the ruler and stronger, and the loss of the subject and servant, and injustice, the opposite. For the unjust is lord over the truly simple and just. He is the stronger, and his subjects do what is for his interest, and minister to his happiness, which is very far from being their own. The beginning of this passage seems like Thrasymachus is just reasserting what he's already asserted, that justice is the interest of the stronger. And he goes further to say it's the loss of the subject or servant. In the second part of this passage, things get a little confusing because Thrasymachus says that the unjust person is the ruler. But didn't he say that the just person is doing what is in the interest of the stronger? So wouldn't the ruler be doing what's in the interest of the stronger and himself? Wouldn't the ruler be just? Here's where I think the confusion lies. Thrasymachus, I think, really believes that there is no such thing as justice. The justice is just a word that gets thrown out by the rulers of the people, by the strong, right? They say, hey, we're going to make these rules, and if you don't follow them, then that's not just. I don't think he really believes that justice is actually a real thing and it's doing what's in the best interest of the stronger. But he does make that claim. And the problem is that saying that that is what justice is goes against what we take to be justice. Here's how I think we can clear up the situation. Let's define folk justice as what people would typically mean by justice, right? So following the laws and also stuff like, being a good person, etc., etc. Not taking advantage of people like you would imagine, the tyrant to be. And we'll call T justice Thrasymachus justice. And that's his sort of special definition, which is that justice is doing what is in the interest of the stronger. I think what Thrasymachus means to say is that the folk unjust people have an advantage over the folk just people, because they can cheat and stuff. And that allows them to gain power over the folk just people. So the folk unjust people are the powerful ones, they're the rulers. T-justice is then doing what is in their best interest. So they are T-just, but they are folk unjust. In other words, they are doing what is in their best interest, but they are also unjust in the way we typically would mean by the word justice, what most people would consider just. This is also the beginning of a new claim by Thrasymachus, and I'll label this proposition U, which is that it is better to be folk unjust than to be folk just. And his first reason for thinking so is that the folk unjust get to rule over, and they have power over the folk just. Consider further, most foolish Socrates, that the just is always a loser in comparison with the unjust. First of all, in private contracts, wherever the unjust is the partner of the just, you will find that when the partnership is dissolved, the unjust man has always more and the just less. Secondly, in their dealings with the state, when there's an income tax, the just man will pay more and the unjust less on the same amount of income. And when there's anything to be received, the one gains nothing and the other much. Observe also what happens when they take an office. There's the just man neglecting his affairs and perhaps suffering other losses and getting nothing out of it to the public because he's just. Moreover, he is hated by his friends and acquaintance for refusing to serve them in unlawful ways. But all this is reversed in the case of the unjust man. So his second reason is in business. The unjust man gets the better end of the business deal over the just man every single time. Third, in taxes. The unjust man gets to cheat on his taxes, so he has to pay less, and when the refund comes back, he gets more than the just man. And finally, in politics, the unjust man gets to benefit his friends and so is very loved because he gets to cheat, and he also gets to benefit his own estate, whereas the just man has to neglect his estate, and his friends hate him because he doesn't cheat for them. I'm speaking as before of injustice on a large scale, in which the advantage of the unjust is more apparent. And my meaning will be most clearly seen if we turn to that highest form of injustice in which the criminal is the happiest of men, and the sufferers, or those who refuse to do injustice, are the most miserable. That is to say, tyranny, which by fraud and force takes away the property of others, not little by little, but wholesale, comprehending in one things sacred as well as profane, private and public, for which acts of wrong, if he were detected perpetrating any one of them singly, he would be punished and incur great disgrace. They who do such wrong in particular cases are called robbers of temples, and manstealers, and burglars, and swindlers, and thieves. But when a man, besides taking away the money of the citizens, has made slaves of them, then instead of these names of reproach, he is termed happy and blessed, not only by the citizens, but by all who hear of his having achieved the consummation of injustice. So, one possible objection to this argument that he's giving is that people do unjust things, folk unjust things now. When they do folk unjust things, they always pay for it. People can console themselves by saying, well, he'll get what's coming to him. But Thrasymachus says, I'm speaking about injustice on a larger scale, right? Like gaining control of the whole country. Sure, if you steal one thing and you get busted for it, right, you're going to jail and it's going to suck for you. But if you conquer an entire nation, now all of a sudden that kind of stuff doesn't happen. In fact, the opposite people think very highly of you. This is a weird idea that's actually explored in Fyodor Dostoevsky's book, Crime and Punishment. Fantastic book. I love that book. Definitely highly recommend. But the idea is that, Napoleon caused the deaths of, hundreds of thousands of people. And yet he was lauded by a lot of people as this grand person. But what was the point of what he was doing? He just wanted to conquer, right? He just wanted to control everything. And for that reason, people suffered and died. He didn't just kill a few people. He killed hundreds of thousands. If he killed a few people, he would have been a murderer. But he kills, hundreds of thousands of people. And all of a sudden he's heralded as this, this hero of the Empire of France. And there are even people that have done awful things that really have never had anything bad happen to them because of it. In fact, it seems like you hit a certain point, and you are untouchable at that point. Think about like Joseph Stalin, horrific human being, right? If you've heard about, the stuff that happened in the Holocaust, a lot of people don't realize that, communist Russia was doing just as bad things. More people died in Russia than died in the concentration camps. And same horrific stuff. And here's a guy that maintained his power through awful means and yet never really had to pay for them. Now, if you believe in some kind of, second life or life after death, then there's the possibility that those people have to pay for their crimes. But if you don't, then it seems like these people who've done awful things, as long as they've gone far enough, they've conquered an entire nation or maybe an entire empire, enslaved a whole group of people, that they will get all the benefits of those things and they won't ever have to pay for them. That is really what Thrasymachus is pointing out, and it sucks that it's actually kind of true. But moving on. For mankind, censure injustice, fearing that they may be the victims of it, and not because they shrink from committing it. In other words, another objection you could give is that, yeah, but we hate the, folk unjust people that do these bad things. And his response is the only reason that we really worry about it at all, the only reason that we're calling them bad people is because we don't want to have to suffer those things, not because we wouldn't do it ourselves in the same situation. And this is an idea that will be explored later on in the Republic, in the Ring of Gyges passage, one of my favorites. Such an fascinating thought experiment that we'll get to eventually. And thus, as I have shown, Socrates, injustice, when on a sufficient scale, has more strength and freedom and mastery than justice. And as I said at first, justice is the interest of the stronger, whereas injustice is a man's own profit and interest. Thrasymachus, when he had thus spoken, having like a bathman deluged our ears with his words, had a mind to go away. But the company would not let him. They insisted that he should remain and defend his position, and I myself added my own humble request that he would not leave us. Thrasymachus, I said to him, excellent man, how suggestive are your remarks? And are you going to run away before you've fairly taught or learned whether they are true or not? Is the attempt to determine the way of man's life so small a matter in your eyes? To determine how life may be passed by each one of us to the greatest advantage? Again, Socrates is making the point, and Plato agrees, that this is not no big deal. This isn't just, we're coming up with some ideas. Our answer to this question will tell us how we should live the rest of our lives. Whether we should be unjust and, go out there and try to become the Übermensch and conquer and set up empires, or whether we should be just and live a totally different kind of life. And do I differ from you, he said, as to the importance of the inquiry? You appear rather, I replied, to have no care or thought about us, Thrasymachus. Whether we live better or worse from not knowing what you say you know, is to you a matter of indifference. Prithee, friend, do not keep your knowledge to yourself. We're a large party, and any benefit which you can confer upon us will be amply rewarded. For my own part, I openly declare that I am not convinced, and that I do not believe injustice to be more gainful than justice, even if uncontrolled and allowed to have free play. For granting that there may be an unjust man who is able to commit injustice, either by fraud or force, still this does not convince me of the superior advantage of injustice, and there may be others who are in the same predicament with myself. Perhaps we may be wrong. If so, you and your wisdom should convince us that we are mistaken in preferring justice to injustice. And how am I to convince you, he said, if you're not already convinced by what I have just said? What more can I do for you? Would you have me put the proof bodily into your souls? Heaven forbid, I said. I would only ask you to be consistent. Or if you change openly, and let there be no deception. For I must remark, Thrasymachus, if you will recall what was previously said, that although you began by defining the true physician in an exact sense, you did not observe a like exactness when speaking of the shepherd. You thought that the shepherd, as a shepherd, tends the sheep, not with a view to their own good, but like a mere diner or banqueter with a view to the pleasures of the table. Or again, as a trader for sale in the market, and not as a shepherd. In other words, earlier on, Thrasymachus was making the point that when he was talking about rulers, he was using it in this very exact sense. To be a ruler is always to seek your own benefit, and that is the craft of being a ruler. So that when you're not successful in seeking your own interest, we shouldn't call you a ruler because you're not practicing that know-how. Well, Socrates says, when you said about the shepherd, being exact, the shepherd is looking out for the sheep. I mean, sure, the shepherd could also want to sell the sheep or eat the sheep or something like that. But that's not exactly what it is to be a shepherd. Yet surely the art of the shepherd is concerned only with the good of his subjects. He has only to provide the best for them, since the perfection of the art is already ensured whenever all the requirements of it are satisfied. So Socrates' premise earlier, 15, was that the aim of a techne is the perfection of its primary interest. We said that Thrasymachus gives this objection that a techne is practiced for the benefit of the one practicing it. In this case, shepherding is practiced for the benefit of the shepherd. Socrates' response is to say something like, each techne is practiced for the perfection of its own primary interest. Now, why the person practices that craft, that techne, is a different thing altogether. So the craft of ruling is practiced for the perfection of the subjects, but why a ruler chooses to rule, that's a different question. And that was what I was saying just now about the ruler. I conceive that the art of the ruler, considered as ruler, whether in a state or in private life, could only regard the good of his flock or subjects, whereas you seem to think that the rulers in states, that is to say the true rulers, like being in authority. Think, nay, I am sure of it. Then why in the case of lesser offices do men never take them willingly without payment, unless under the idea that they govern for the advantage not of themselves but of others? Let me ask you a question. Are not the several arts different by reason of their each having a separate function? And my dear illustrious friend, do say what you think, that we may make a little progress. So I'm going to come back to this idea later on when he talks about, but why do they take money, we'll put a bookmark in that. He's going to talk about it a little bit more later. So the first premise here, he says, is that each techne is different because they have a different function. Yes, that is the difference, he replied. And each art gives us a particular good, and not merely a general one. Medicine, for example, gives us health, navigation, safety at sea, and so on. Yes, he said. So not only is each techne different because they have a different function, but they also have different benefit. And the art of payment has the special function of giving pay. But we do not confuse this with other arts, any more than the art of the pilot is to be confused with the art of medicine, because the health of a pilot may be improved by a sea voyage. You would not be inclined to say, would you, that navigation is the art of medicine, at least if we were to adopt your exact use of language? So in other words, just because, you're a sailor on a boat and your health will improve because, the fresh ocean air, that doesn't mean we call the art of sailing the art of medicine. And so our next proposition is that the function and benefit of pay belong to a separate techne from ruling, among others. Certainly not. Or because a man is in good health when he receives pay, you would not say that the art of payment is medicine. I should say not. Nor would you say that medicine is the art of receiving pay because a man takes fees when he is engaged in healing. Certainly not. And we have admitted, I said, that the good of each art is specially confined to the art. Yes. Then if there be any good which all artists have in common, that is to be attributed to something of which they have the common use. So in other words, one reason to believe that the function and benefit of pay belong to a separate techne from ruling is that all the various techne make money. So that can't be the specific benefit and function of any one of them individually. True, he replied. And when the artist is benefited by receiving pay, the advantage is gained by an additional use of the art of pay, which is not the art professed by him. He gave a reluctant assent to this. Then the pay is not derived by the several artists from their respective arts. But the truth is that while the art of medicine gives health, and the art of the builder builds a house, another art attends them, which is the art of pay. The various arts may be doing their own business and benefiting that over which they preside, but would the artist receive any benefit from his art unless he were paid as well? I suppose not. But does he therefore confer no benefit when he works for nothing? In other words, another reason to believe that the function and benefit of pay belong to a separate techne from all the others is that you can practice those other techne without being paid. Certainly he confers a benefit. Then now, Thrasymachus, there's no longer any doubt that neither arts nor governments provide for their own interests. But as we were before saying, they rule and provide for the interest of their subjects, who are the weaker and not the stronger. To their good they attend and not to the good of the superior. So the conclusion number 23 here, ruling is not the techne of benefiting yourself. And this is the reason, my dear Thrasymachus, why, as I was just now saying, no one is willing to govern. Because no one likes to take in hand the reformation of evils which are not his concern without remuneration. For in the execution of his work and in giving his order to another, the true artist does not regard his own interest, but always that of his subjects. And therefore, in order that rulers may be willing to rule, they must be paid in one of three modes of payment: money, or honor, or a penalty for refusing. So here's his second response. And this is something I said, put a bookmark in it. We talk about it later. That if ruling were the techne of benefiting yourself, then these rulers wouldn't have to be induced to rule. They would just, want to benefit themselves. And yet instead, they demand to have some kind of a paycheck because it sucks, because they're not benefiting themselves. What do you mean, Socrates? Said Glaucon. The first two modes of payment are intelligible enough, but what the penalty is, I do not understand, or how a penalty can be a payment. You mean that you do not understand the nature of this payment, which to the best men is the great inducement to rule. Of course you know that ambition and avarice are held to be, as indeed they are, a disgrace. So in other words, there are three reasons he just gave that a person might be induced to rule. He might be tempted to rule. Number one, paycheck. Number two, for the honor of it. And number three, because there's a threat of penalty. He says those first two, the really good man isn't going to rule for those two reasons, those first two reasons. We say that people who are greedy or people who love honor, those people are looked down upon a little bit. Very true. And for this reason, I said, money and honor have no attraction for them. Good men do not wish to be openly demanding payment for governing, and so to get the name of hirelings, nor by secretly helping themselves out of the public revenues to get the name of thieves. And not being ambitious, they do not care about honor. Wherefore, necessity must be laid upon them, and they must be induced to serve from the fear of punishment. And this, as I imagine, is the reason why the forwardness to take office, instead of waiting to be compelled, has been deemed dishonorable. Now the worst part of this punishment is that he who refuses to rule is liable to be ruled by one who is worse than himself. And the fear of this, as I conceive, induces the good to take office not because they would, but because they can't help it, not under the idea that they are going to have any benefit or enjoyment themselves, but as a necessity, and because they're not able to commit the task of ruling to anyone who is better than themselves, or indeed as good. So here's an interesting new proposition that threat of punishment that he's talking about. We'll call this, by the way, we'll label this new proposition BR, that the best men rule only because lesser men ruling would be worse than them having to rule themselves. In other words, they don't want to rule, but when they think about other people ruling, they're like, oh, that's going to be bad, right? It's going to be bad for me. So they have to rule. They don't want to, but they have to. But there's reason to think that if a city were composed entirely of good men, then to avoid office would be as much an object of contention as to obtain office is at present. Then we should have plain proof that the true ruler is not meant by nature to regard his own interest, but that of his subjects. And everyone who knew this would choose rather to receive a benefit from another than to have the trouble of conferring one. So far am I from agreeing with Thrasymachus that justice is the interest of the stronger. So in other words, BR would be supported. Here's a prediction that he's making, that if you had a city that was full of just good men, then nobody would want to actually rule. Everybody would be, trying to avoid ruling because they would know, this guy would be doing just as good of a job as I would, and I don't have to do the ruling. In this case, it would prove that justice isn't doing what's in the best interest of the ruler. If it were doing what's in the best interest of the ruler, then these people would all want to be the ruler. But since they know that, the other guy's going to do just as good a job of me and I don't have to rule, that shows that there is no benefit for them. This latter question need not be further discussed at present. In other words, BR, we'll come back to it. But when Thrasymachus says that the life of the unjust is more advantageous than that of the just, his new statement appears to me to be of far more serious character. In other words, this was proposition U, that it's better to be folk unjust than to be folk just. And really, I think that is the big question for us too. Is it better for me to, cheat and get stuff that I wanted, or is it better for me not to cheat? What advantage do I have to following the rules, to being just? Because exactly what this definition of justice is, is Thrasymachus correct, or Socrates, or, Polemarchus, or any of these guys? That's interesting for sure, but really what we want to know in our everyday lives is, should I do the right thing? Why should I do the right thing? Which of us has spoken truly? And which sort of life, Glaucon, do you prefer? Well, I, for my part, deem the life of the just to be the more advantageous, he answered. Do you hear all the advantages of the unjust, which Thrasymachus was rehearsing? Those were those four supporting arguments that Thrasymachus gave for his assertion. That the unjust rule over the just, that in business they make more money, that in taxes they have to pay less and they get back more, and that in politics they get to benefit their own estate and they get to make better friends. Yes, I heard him, he replied, but he has not convinced me. Then shall we try to find some way of convincing him, if we can, that he is saying what is not true? Most certainly, he replied. If, I said, he makes a set speech and we make another recounting all the advantages of being just, and he answers and we rejoin, there must be a numbering and a measuring of the goods which are claimed on either side, and in the end we shall want judges to decide. But if we proceed in our inquiry as we lately did, by making admissions to one another, we shall unite the offices of judge and advocate in our own persons. In other words, what he's saying here is, do we want to proceed like a debate or like a dialogue? In a debate, you have your speech, I have my speech, we list off all our things, we have a judge in the end that says like, okay, this side won, yay. But if we just go along, talking to each other where, we agree or disagree, then we won't have to worry about all that kind of rigmarole. Now, Plato obviously is very into dialogue. I mean, all the works that we have of his are written in dialogue, so he definitely approves of the dialogue. I do think this is interesting because I've seen both formats. I've seen people that operate in a debate format, and it is very restricting, and that is nice in some ways because it means that you can't go wildly off topic. It means that you can't interrupt each other, right? You can't shout over each other or anything like that. But then it's also the case that, somebody says something and you want to be able to respond to maybe that one thing right away, or you want to ask for clarification right away, and then, just talk to the person, and you have this restriction, like you're not allowed to talk for those 20 minutes or whatever it is. Whereas in a dialogue, you can kind of go back and forth and you can ask the person, do you believe this? Yes. Oh, then what about this? And that's the way Socrates really prefers to go about it. And it's definitely, a lot friendlier format. But I don't know. I kind of see benefits for both sides. I think the debate has its place and I think the dialogue has its place. Very good, he said. And which method do I understand you to prefer? I said, well, that which you propose. So in the next video, we'll start to look at Socrates' critique of Thrasymachus' idea that the unjust person benefits more than the just person. To review real quick, Thrasymachus threw out this objection that the shepherd only practices shepherding to benefit himself, not to benefit the sheep. And by analogy, the ruler would be practicing ruling just to benefit himself and not to benefit the ruled. Socrates responded that, the purpose of shepherding is to take care of those sheep. The reason why the shepherd does the shepherding, that's something entirely different, and it could be to benefit himself, and it could be, I don't know, because his family makes him, I don't know. And in the same way, the techne of ruling is to benefit the ruled people, and why the ruler does so, that's a different question. And his second response is that it's clearly not the case that ruling is a techne of benefiting yourself, because the ruler requires some external motivation, right? If it were just the art of benefiting yourself, then he wouldn't demand a paycheck, or she wouldn't be ruling for honor, or they wouldn't be ruling because, they're trying to avoid the worst ruler. In the next video, Socrates will be evaluating that proposition U. Is it the case that being folk unjust is better than being folk just? At first blush, it definitely seems like it, right? It seems like what Thrasymachus is saying is true, that the unjust person would make more money in business, would get more back for taxes, etc., etc. Is that the case? We'll find out in the next video.